Hello, Robs. I know I shouldn't start on a new book while I've got piles of books already started, but this is a recent acquisition from 1997. The Review of Contemporary Fiction, pardon. And the main reason why I got it was for the feature story, The Bookstore in America, which was Borders Books, which is a legendary bookstore that failed when they should never have failed under any circumstances. But it's 20-30 page read, so let's do it. Of course, I'm probably going to break the spine doing this. Alan Burns and Wilson Harris. I don't believe. I don't know why they put this little checklist at the beginning. But let's get to it. Borders Bookshop. Page 2, starting at 216. The Bookstore in America, Borders. This is the first in a series of articles that will appear about bookstores and bookselling in America. At first glance, it might seem odd that this is a subject worth theorizing about. Perhaps even odder that the Review of Contemporary Fiction would be the place for such a series. And yet the bookstore remains the primary place where Americans find their books, or in many cases can't find them. While some people might place the responsibility for the availability of books with the publisher is the first to know that the system, haphazard, capricious, and non-systematic as it is, whereby books are published and remain in print, is a complex combination of what the publisher would like to publish, what the review media might pay attention to, and what stores might stock and keep on their shelves. Without the latter, the two falling into place, the publisher must decide whether there is any point in publishing, that is, making public a work that few people will ever see or hear about. Therefore, what gets published and made available to American readers is in large part determined by a combination of forces that historically have not been carefully analyzed or thought about. Except in economic terms, e.g., publisher X is making a profit or going out of business, bookstore Y is losing out to the chains, Review Media Z covers only those books from major publishers who, coincidentally, take out expensive ad space. But rarely, if ever, do we have these subjects considered from the point of view of what the culture, society, and republic may need, if not always want, and what it means for a country to have its books more or less reduced to marketplace value, whether that be the marketplace of the store or review media or, finally, the publisher. Since these issues do not get discussed from points of view other than economic ones, and since Americans implicitly embrace the marketplace explanation as existing on a level with freedom of expression and the right to vote, that is, self-evident truths or rights that need not be inspected, the book business is generally left untouched by analysis, except in marketplace terms. And of late, much of this discussion has been directed at such things as the enormous advances that publishers pay a few authors, while paying less attention to its mid-list, aka money-losing authors, and the conglomeration of American publishing into a very few giants. Book review pages as an extension of entertainment coverage, that is, tell the public about what it wants to hear. And more recently, the emergence of chain and super bookstores that are driving independence into bankruptcy and, at least according to various lawsuits, indulging in unfair trade practices. What is inevitably left out of almost all of these discussions are such matters as, is the American public well served by this system? Are more and varied voices published and promoted? Do we have fewer alternatives available to us? Is the book industry, like almost all other industries in the country, becoming more and more homogenized? Leaving aside the author, the system consists of the publisher, the review media by which books become known and talked about, and the bookstore. through which the books are accessible to the public. Although all three of these deserve close inspection, this series will focus on the bookstore, about which we have little historical information. How many were there 100 years ago, 50 years ago? And nearly no theoretical information. Why do they exist? Why does someone open one? Is it only a business, or does it have a public service dimension by which, for instance, it attempts to keep certain books on its shelves regardless of how poorly they might sell in a year's time? In brief, what at present is the relationship between commerce and culture as reflected in bookstores, and what, given the current situation, might we expect in the future? Rather than starting safely and more or less risk-free, I am beginning this series with a consideration of Borders, Books, and Music, the chain of stores popularly referred to as superstores. To those in the business, public discussion of Borders, except to attack it as a conglomerate trying to drive independent bookstores out of business, is not only unpopular, but can be, for a publisher at least, suicidal. In this article, as well as in the series as a whole, I am not interested in indulging in the controversies of chains versus independence. Rather, my interest is in what is currently happening with stores, how they see their role in the community, what they see their responsibilities to be, and what we might expect in the future. I am also not interested in whether one chain is better than another, which store has the smartest business practices, what discounts publishers should provide to stores, and any other economic issues that typically arise, or complaints that individuals, people, or companies might have that can be reduced to one day I was treated rudely by a clerk. My intention is to get at trends in philosophies, practices, and policies, and then test these out to the degree possible. So, for instance, if a store claims to specialize in poetry, then how is this evidenced by the selection of titles in the store, buying practices, methods used to ensure that the store reaches for poetry from all publishers rather than the easy-to-find commercial publishers? Poetry readings, the store sponsors, and so on. For these purposes, I am acting as little more than a book buyer trying to figure out how all of this works and what it means to me. My premise in undertaking this series is that bookselling in America has radically changed in the last few years and will more dramatically change in years to come. Despite the conservative nature of the book industry and its resistance to making changes that occurred in other forms of retail businesses many years ago, I believe that the emergence of national chain bookstores was a historical inevitability, held back in part because of the lack of computerization for inventory control that could keep track of these small objects as they moved out of warehouses into stores and onto shelves, as well as necessary capital to finance growth, but primarily held back by a mentality that resists change of almost any kind. That is, there seems to be a psychological dimension to the book and what it represents that causes people to want to retain old practices and related to how books are handled. While most other businesses in America long ago went in the direction of superstores, Sears and Roebuck being the first and primary example, and many now have, in various ways, moved back into playing niche roles. Specialty stores which, though part of a national network, still focus on primarily one commodity. And here Starbucks is perhaps the best example. The book business still generally goes along in its 19th century mode of behavior. When chains first emerged in the United States, they were Walden Books and B. Dalton's, primarily mall stores of about 2,000 square feet, with about 40,000 titles. These stores were, with a few exceptions, driven by discount marketing and a selection of books that would appeal to mall shoppers. The superstores, however, came on the scene with 150,000 titles, and although discounting and marketing characterized their emergence, something else was happening: in-depth selections. Discounting was a given, but now the stores were competing on the basis of quality, not just size or price, and much of this quality is determined by a combination of company philosophy and purchasing practices of the buyers at the companies. Does the company believe that it should stock a poetry book that sells only one copy a year? Does the buyer have the intelligence to be able to distinguish, regardless of sales, the difference between an important poetry book that sells poorly from an unimportant one? In brief, inventory control, marketing, and discounting may be necessary conditions of the success of superstores, but they are not sufficient conditions. If these stores are not finally known for quality, they will not survive. In fact, the very computerization that makes them possible does not supplant the role of the buyer. For instance, a buyer at one superstore may decide to order 35 copies of a book for all of its stores, and quite likely the result will be that the chain does not, at year's end, sell very many copies of the book, which becomes a form of both self-justification and self-fulfilling prophecy. At the same time, a buyer at another chain will, based upon his or her own knowledge and belief in the title, order 500 copies of the same title for several stores, and will wind up selling a few hundred copies, in which case the computer will in effect tell the buyer that this is a title that should be kept in stock. Neither modeling system, that is, the decision of a buyer to order 35 copies for 15 of its stores based upon a combination of past performance for this author's previous books or previous editions, nor the raw information the computer provides will take the place of a knowledge, experience, and commitment of a buyer. And this is as true for independent stores as it is for superstores. One of the dramatic changes that I see is that visiting a bookstore in the past, a solitary experience usually engaged in by people well past 20 or 30 years of age, cramped into small quarters and narrow aisles with respectful quietude, usually reserved for libraries and church, has changed in its social dimension and meaning. In relation to the superstores, book shopping is becoming a family outing, providing places to sit, wide aisles, as many as 200,000 different titles in a wide variety of subjects, reading groups, long hours, and on and on. What are the cultural implications of children spending hours in bookstores? An almost unheard of experience even 10 years ago, except for precocious and extremely well-behaved children. Rather than making this question completely rhetorical, I will suggest that, as a college professor for many years, I found it common to have freshmen who had never been in a bookstore, though they knew their way around movie theaters and record stores. Will there be long-term effects of having children become accustomed to knowing their way around bookstores at an early age? My theory here is this blue jay. This bird, where is he? My God. Oh, man. My theory here is that there will be a significant cultural effect, though we won't know what it is for several years to come. What then becomes of the independent store that cannot or does not have a large stock of books, nor a great deal of space? Does it have a function, or does it merely fall victim to Borders and Barnes and Noble? I think it does have a function that will ensure its future, but a function that will require changes. Some independent stores have moved in the direction of developing practices that would seem to guarantee that they are becoming the homogenized monsters that the chains are usually accused of being, while others, however, by conceiving of themselves as alternatives to what is available elsewhere, have made themselves nearly indispensable to their communities because they can do things that generally fall outside the realm of what chains can do. My hope in this series is to initiate a discussion of the future of stores as related to the cultural role stores serve. That will be useful rather than a free-for-all and a brick-throwing contest, though the latter, at least in my part, may be unavoidable. The second part of this series will be devoted to Woodland Pattern Bookstore in Milwaukee. Next video will be Borders and Overview, the history, philosophy, etc. Goodbye, Brobs. Goodbye.